Thanks, everybody. I usually will just start our sessions, our discussions with a really sort of informal greeting and to tell you a little bit about what the Be Better Club is. Sterling, I think you named the club, as a matter of fact, when we first got started. And I got some pushback from a colleague of mine who said, aren't we good enough? Or doesn't that seem like suggesting we're not good enough? And I agree. And if anybody has a suggestion for a better name, I am all for it. But basically, the Be Better Club, as we've so called it, is a chance to get together as a community and just talk about contemporary ethical issues. We don't get to do that in classes very much because things are so structured, and we don't really get to do that in our professional lives very much for much the same reason. So you should have all seen the schedule, I think, that I sent around. We're looking at doing these discussion group sessions once a month on the last Tuesday of every month from 3 to 4:30-ish. And we've mapped out some topics, but as I say every year, if you've got other things you'd like to talk about in these groups, let me know. And I may very well add a couple of other sessions.
Can everybody hear Jonathan? I'm unable to hear him.
Oh, no.
Okay, I'll check my equipment.
Okay. When Stephen comes back, I'll tell him I didn't really say anything important anyway. What I was going to say is last year's discussions led to some follow-up questions, and I've been having conversations over the summer. So we might add some additional sessions in between. So I'll send out special announcements for those as they come along, but you could plan on this time, the last Tuesday every month, and we'll do these discussions. And you saw each one is coupled to a podcast. So you should be able to listen to those at any time. And we'll use those as kind of rough framing for the problems we're addressing. So that all makes sense to everybody? Now, since it's our first session, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the podcast for today. This was a podcast from the podcast called Overthink by two philosophers, Ellie Anderson and Pina Guzman. And it's really, they're kind of lovely to listen to. They've got a really good rapport going back and forth. They've known each other for a long time. And this podcast came about, good, Steve. This podcast came about as out of some advocacy work that Pina Guzman had been doing around animal personhood. And so they were basically asking the question of animal personhood. And for me, as a philosopher, that is one of the most important questions in ethics. It's the question of moral standing. And when we think about ethical issues, whatever they might be, at the root of those are targets of ethics, right? Not everything is a target of ethics. So we're talking about problems of justice or harms or autonomy or whatever it might be. All those questions are targeted to a specific group of stakeholders, for lack of a better term. The set of things that is morally considerable. And that really is what is at the heart of this discussion about personhood. But personhood is a very particular sort of animal, if you will. So the question is now about rights in personhood. So there's a lot to say about animal welfare, but I thought I might just first start off by saying, how familiar are all of you with this discussion about personhood and non-human animals? And you've got a little bit, yeah?
I listened to the broadcast.
So Stephen, is that the extent of it so far, is the podcast?
No, I've done a bit more research in that area as well, about animal rights and so on, that are well-related area.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And so we could start with a little bit of history, and maybe we should do that. Oh, wow, this is very exciting. I have now 6 Jason Ortizes in the conversation.
You can never have enough. I'm just hoping I don't multiply. But back to what you said, Jonathan, about the issue of personhood, I have not followed it. It's not my research bailiwick, but I think it comes up in popular media, and so we probably all had some level of exposure to it. I think it most often gets driven, it gets driven by science as we learn to do better experiments and come to realize that animal behavior is so much more complex than we expected. You see startling examples of intelligence out there. You know, it used to be so many people just thought, okay, birds are birds, they eat seeds or do what birds do. And then we find out, oh no, ravens and crows are tool users. Okay, if tool using demarcates intelligence for the human species, then maybe this idea of personhood or something applies to birds and, other primates, and maybe dolphins if they're so smart, and maybe octopi and, other cephalopods. Even though they live 2 years, they do some incredible things. And I think partly what's driving this debate is the supposedly intelligent species on the planet, humans, being less dumb about how we ask that question, how we leverage science to address that question. We discover critters out there doing some pretty amazing things, and the idea of personhood I really like, because it's not just respect for things living. It really asks, as you said, rights. Are they entitled to rights? And so I think it's an interesting discussion. We've all encountered it. Most recently, well, not that recent, but I guess I remember the case where a monkey, I think, picked up a camera and took a picture. Was it a selfie or whatever? But I may get this wrong, but I think it ended up in the courts. Someone asked whether the animal has rights to the photograph, or if someone uses the photograph, are they stealing the copyright effectively of the animal? And so it gets to the question of personhood. Does the monkey have rights that humans have rights? Maybe I got that. Maybe I gave a tortured rendition of that story, but I think this is a recurring thing. It keeps coming up, and what I like is it mostly comes up because we're not smart enough to ask the right questions. So I'm glad you're helping us think about the right questions to ask.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. This is one of my favorite topics, and I think you're right on. I mean, you said two things that I want to draw our attention to. The first is we are becoming less dumb, and I like that phrasing. We're becoming more vocal about the ways in which we are more like other non-human animals in the world, and that's a big part of the animal ethics and animal science intersection. Now, the intersection is what I want to draw our attention to, because we know more stuff now, but it's not as though we couldn't have known more stuff before. And so there's a really important bigger picture thing going on around ethics, and that is the science we do, the questions we ask about the natural world around us are driven, at least in part, and maybe I would argue in large part, by the values we bring to the table. So the more we as citizens and as scientists and as philosophers start to ask questions about, wait, we know a little bit about octopi, and we saw a raven look at itself in the mirror, and a monkey took a selfie, and like all of these instances are starting to draw our attention in this way, in asking these questions that are at their heart ethical questions. And then in sort of a reciprocal relationship, we start asking the scientific questions, like, wait, is that true about ravens? Do they really recognize themselves in mirrors? And we develop experiments around that, which then lead to more experiments and more hypotheses that are both epistemic and ethical. And that way that our knowledge is coupled to our values is at the heart of the ethics we're doing, right? And so science is so tightly coupled to these ethical questions, it's really hard to pull apart. It's like a chicken or an egg problem, right? It's like, which comes first? Are we asking the questions because of our values, or is the science informing our values? And the answer is, yeah, both of those things is happening. Now, what's happening in this case is, so the other thing to say that you pointed out, Steve, is that there's a long history of questions about kind of building arguments by analogy. So in what way are non-human animals like us? And that's a I guess I'd like label it as like an Enlightenment perspective, and that is, sorry, bear with me for 1 second. Zoom is going to log me out in 4 minutes. Now it's not. I guess we're good. Building an argument by analogy. So in some sense, we've sort of said, okay, human beings are the paradigm for what is a set of morally considerable things. Now, we don't have to go back very far to pull that argument apart too and say, well, really, it's like a subset of human beings. And then we sort of emerged into the global era of globalization in the 19th and 20th centuries and came up with this idea of human dignity, which has some moral weight most of the time. And so there's this idea that human beings generally are morally considerable. And then we build these arguments by analogy, and we've done that forever. And I think Pina Guzman and Anderson did a really good job of drawing our attention to some of the philosophical history there, right? So a lot of folks, and I see Dr. Jensen's here too, a lot of folks will know this history very, very well. So feel free to weigh in. But you think back to the arguments that we've made by analogy, or the ways we've tried to differentiate ourselves from non-human animals. Pina Guzman mentions Rene Descartes and Malebranche, the two sort of rationalist thinkers who divided the world up into persons and things. There were really only two classes in the world. one class of persons and one class of things. And the class of persons, as those of you who know some history of philosophy here, those are the class of things with souls or with rational capacity. This is the same story really that's going to be inherited by Immanuel Kant and everybody up until the Enlightenment. And the idea here is that there's a set of things in the world that matter, that have some capacity that matters, and a set of things, objects. And for Descartes, there's, of course, the Cartesians were really famous. And a lot of you have taken sort of intro to philosophy will have heard these stories. Cartesians were really famous for thinking about non-human animals as mechanism, right? So we know a lot about what we know about anatomy today because of experiments that were done at that era, which took for granted the idea that there's really no difference between, say, the sound a dog makes when you're vivisecting it and the sound a clock makes when you throw a wrench into its works. Because those two things, dogs and clocks, are of the same set. They're things, they're objects, they're mechanism. Now, you wouldn't do those things, you shouldn't do those things, a normative claim here, to human animals or human beings, because they're a different set of things. So we build this analogy, right? Things matter to us because maybe they have souls or they're rational. That's the Enlightenment, the rationalist perspective. Maybe it's because, Steve, as you mentioned, because they have language or rational capacity. Maybe the argument from the ravens example was that ravens are self-conscious and human beings are self-conscious. And so there's an analogy that is they can recognize themselves, have a conception of self. Maybe it's because non-human animals and human animals both experience pleasures and pains. So they're both sentient, and that's what matters. And basically what we're doing is building argument by argument by argument. So the question for us maybe is, where do we draw that line? What's the boundary of the things that matter?
Can I add one thing, Jonathan?
Yeah,
I don't remember if this was a Be Better topic. I think it's come into our discussions last year, but maybe a related topic for Be Better Club is when AI gets really good, will they have personhood? So I think it's connected because it gets to our definition of personhood versus thing. And that's an example where technology, maybe not our stupidity in asking questions, but our smartness in developing AI or it developing itself calls into question what's a thing versus a person. So there's two weird ways to kind of come at the same questions, which I love that only philosophy can really help us disentangle.
Dr. Jentz, I saw your hand or your wave there. Do you want to weigh in?
Well, I feel now we're on a different track, so maybe not. My question is, when I read the announcement for today, it starts with a question of what has rights. And I feel so far we have largely talked about what is similar versus what has rights. And I think when we start with the what has rights question, we may not have to solve all these tricky questions of similarity and dissimilarity, because we already are doing this. We acknowledge that corporations, which are artificial assemblies on paper, but ultimately of people, are legal persons and have standing. In many countries, animals now have legal standing. In some people say nature should have standing. So if we start perhaps maybe with why we are worried about this, we can bypass a little bit the tricky definition of what before we start, and maybe it makes it easier. So I was wondering whether maybe we can talk a little bit about why we care about this similarity, dissimilarity. Is it purely because we are curious about the world and we are considering how we as humans may or may not at all be unique, or has it to do with that we are having real consequences that come from this decision of what is a person? Like, can we destroy an artificial intelligence and turn it off? And is that legal? That's the question that was just a few weeks ago in the news about the Google AI. You know, like, what if we turn it off? Are we killing something against its will potentially?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Jentz. So we've got two buckets, and I sort of led us astray down the first path because I think it's really important. The path is the welfare path. right? And Anderson and Guzman, Pina Guzman set this up for us too, but I'm trying to draw our attention to it. The welfare path is the traditional path of, say, animal ethics. Philosophers spend a lot of time asking these questions that Dr. Jensch is saying are so murky, right? We don't have good answers to them despite decades of philosophical work trying to nail them down. So the other bucket, let's set that aside. Like, let's not worry about the welfare bucket and the similarity bucket. Instead, as Dr. Jensch is pointing out, let's focus on the rights bucket. Why do we care, right? Why do we care about these similarities? Why are we having discussions about rights? Let's ask that question first. Stephen, yeah, please.
This might be an area where religion is really not able to help us if Mela Branch is to be believed. She was mentioned in the podcast and basically said that based on the Bible, supposedly animals, and this goes back to Descartes as well, only humans can sin, and that's why we feel pain, and animals can't sin, and therefore they feel no pain. And so they're like machines. We can do with them what we please from a religious standpoint. I was unaware of that interesting argument, and I'm sure maybe modern versions don't accept that, but yeah, that's the history.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nikki, go ahead.
I think, you know how like in geometry, I mean, and of course in philosophy too, and many other things, we like prove things, right? But we're starting with like what's given and then what we're gonna prove from that. And I think that we have not established what's given and what we think is like a common like accepted reality or accepted truth. And I think we're asking, you know, are we humans, are we accountable to nature, to animals, to technology? Are they accountable to us? You know, where is that like mechanism of connection working, and how connected are we, and can we be separate? Can we separate these things? And I don't do a lot of research in this area, but I do a lot of research in indigenous studies and indigenous methods. And they don't ask that question. The given is we are all accountable to each other. We are accountable to like the mountains and the rivers and the land and each other and animals, and how we move. Like, then we ask other questions. So, I mean, I know like how this was opened up today was very much, you know, Northern Hemisphere, European perspectives. And I just think it's interesting that, you know, as was already said before, like what questions are we asking and how does that shape where we're going? And I think that's changing.
Yeah, I agree. Jason and Joy, you're next. I want to jump in here to just to follow up with Stephen and Nikki. Yeah, the history here, I mean, we don't need to be restricted to sort of Western philosophical traditions, but to Florian's point, like the history of religion, whether that's, you know, a domination view or a stewardship view of sort of Christian, Judeo-Christian traditions of nature, or whether it's indigenous views, North American indigenous views especially have this sense of kinship with the living world. And so there's a sense of co-responsibility, as Nikki pointed out. Both of those views haven't protected the natural world in any meaningful sense, right? Something has gone wrong with the moral view that's disconnected to the practical. And part of that is, I think, why there's this push for the rights perspective. It's a different normative lens with which to view our relationship to things. And supposedly, it's supposed to be more helpful. And I think there's really practical reasons to say, and we're going to circle back around after Jason and Joy, because Dr. Jensch mentioned the argument about corporations being persons. And, right. And there's this really famous piece by Christopher Stone about the legal standing of trees. And we're going to pull that apart and see differences in those arguments. But Jason and then Joy, go ahead. Jason, we can't hear you yet. Joy, do you want to go ahead while we're waiting on Jason's connection?
Sure. Okay. I was just thinking when it comes to like our accountability with and relationship with nature and stuff, humans have this like this natural guilt and this natural greed that you don't always see among other species. And so we kind of have this desire to utilize the resources of nature, but we also feel this responsibility for what we do with nature, whereas with animals, a lot of times they will utilize the resources without the guilt, and eventually symbiosis kind of settles into place. But I also noticed, as Nikki said about the indigenous people, they kind of found a way of balancing it and utilizing the resources without damaging their environment, thereby mitigating the guilt that humans as thinkers tend to feel heavily.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. That's well said. And I'll point out, and I'm sure I would be interested in Nikki's perspective here as the resident expert on indigenous perspectives, but I wouldn't want to overstate the case, right? I think in the same way that some Christian traditions or Judeo-Christian traditions espouse a stewardship view of the natural world, so too do indigenous communities espouse a kinship view, but practically that doesn't always work. It's not as if indigenous people just live harmoniously with nature and there's no negative impacts and whatever, right? There's a lot of other factors that go into that relationship. And so we don't want to overstate the ontological case. And to restrict the philosophical language, what I mean is it's not as if our worldview necessarily dictates how we live. And I think that's really, really important. Victor, go ahead.
I kind of have a comment, I guess, for the concept of rights, because this is something that I speak with a lot with political science majors. And I think, I guess from the perspective that we're speaking, we have an assumption what rights are, but depending on the culture, like I think that's kind of what sparked the idea when Nikki had spoken about Native American cultures, that we all have different ways of perceiving what rights are. And I think the issue of personhood and maybe consciousness is something that makes sense in that lens, to try to see like if why do we get rights, or not rights, but the ability to live and not be slaughtered for food, but animals do. And I think that would be a way to tackle this question more so than say like rights, because rights are mean different things for so many different people. Like maybe the fact that I can't think of a good example right off the top of my head, but I guess that's the point I'm trying to get at.
No, that's a good one. And it sounds like, Victor, what you're suggesting is to focus on questions of power, questions of relationship, right? Like somehow the human species has set itself up to, for better or worse, dominate the natural world, have an oversized impact as a species on the natural world. And so we play this predatory role in a maybe loose, non-technical sense, that's outsized compared to other species. And so we could focus on that. I think it's true that I don't think you're wrong that rights mean different things to different people, but I think in this context, when Pina Guzman is thinking about animal rights, we're thinking about it in a really specific sort of legal policy context. And so we'll circle around to that next. Ian, go ahead.
I was actually just about to lower my hand, because that's exactly what I was going to say. So we have to establish if this is the societal legal right, or if this is some intrinsic right that exists before any society is established. But I think we're kind of, that's another tricky wrinkle to add to this, but I think we're about to.
It is, yeah. That's a good transition, Ian. Thanks, I appreciate it. Yeah, so many of you will know the sort of traditional, and we will talk about this next semester in animal ethics, for those of you interested in taking that class, but there's a really traditional in Western philosophy in the 1960s and 70s, really traditional conflict between Peter Singer's sentience view of animal welfare and Tom Reagan's view of animal rights. And to Ian's point, Reagan was after rights in this moral sense, this technical normative sense. And so there's a big conflict in the sort of theoretical positioning and whatever. And that debate kind of I don't overstate the case, but basically we set it aside, and Pina Guzman and contemporary animal ethicists and Ellie Anderson and others are now thinking about rights in this very particular policy context. So that's what I want to focus on next. Florian mentioned corporations as legal persons. And really that's when we're thinking about rights in this context, that's what we're after, is legal personhood. So when a thing has rights in the context we're after now, what we mean is it has legal standing. In 1970 something, somebody should check me on this, 1974 or something, 72, thank you, Florian. Christopher Stone wrote this book, Should Trees Have Moral Standing? And he's legal standing. And after what he's after is also legal personhood. And this is the context for, I'm gonna have to remember the name here, Happy the Elephant at the Bronx Zoo, which just came up in the podcast. It's true of the chimpanzees that Pina Guzman was involved in the lawsuits around. It's true of rivers and natural bodies in New Zealand and South America, several countries now. There have been lots of bodies, natural bodies, that have been fought for in this sense. Now, the reason for that, I think, is practical. And I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound bad coming from me as a philosopher, but it's as if the ethical view has failed, right? That we spent decades trying to protect things in the world, human beings and non-human animals and rivers and mountains, and ethicists failed, right? We made these arguments that were moral arguments, that there were analogies, as Steve had pointed out, analogies between human beings which had moral standing and other things, and so therefore we should worry about non-human animals in the same way. Practically there are holes there, right? And we can think about this in imminently practical terms. For those of you with pets at home, there are certain things that in most of the globe at this point we just don't do to pet animals. And that is predominantly because of moral views, right? Moral shifts. There are laws in place too, but I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that the law followed the moral shift, cultural, societal shifts in thinking about non-human animals. But that's not true of production food animals. It's not true of laboratory animals, particularly invertebrates. It's not true of wild animals, right? And so there are gaps in our thinking. And what the argument is really, the things closest to us matter the most. Some sense we could argue here, if you're into this kind of thing, that there's an ethics of care that's really taken over. That in the same way that I likely care more about you all in this Zoom room than the faceless masses at the university elsewhere, and the same ways that you probably care about your closest family members more than people across the globe, the same argument is made with non-human animals. If you had a pet chicken growing up, for instance, you probably felt very close to that animal. You got to know it really well. You saw analogies with it. You saw characteristics or capacities that it had that made you feel close to it in a way that, like, the chicken that one might buy in a grocery store doesn't have that same closeness, same proximity. But again, no, that's not a rights view. It's not a sentience view. That's a kind of ethics of care view. So we're thinking about the natural world. So that might be endangered species. It might be rivers at risk. It might be mountains that are going to get the tops blown off and mined. It might be indigenous land that has sacred value. The arguments from welfare or sacredness don't work when it comes to policy. What does seem to work are legal arguments. So what's happened, what Pina Guzman and Anderson are starting to thinking through is the relationship between legal personhood and moral personhood. And they don't really tease that apart for us in the podcast. They kind of just think about personhood in this big sense. But I think that's really interesting, right? That if we worry about something morally, the best thing we could do for it is try to get it legal personhood. Now, think with me for a second about corporations. It strikes me, and I would love to hear your perspectives here. It strikes me that that's not really the reason we developed the idea of corporate legal personhood. It's not as though we thought, oh, ExxonMobil, or let me think of something more close, Siemens, right? That they are sort of moral persons and we ought to care for them in some way. Corporate legal personhood is set up to protect the individual assets, right? Corporate leaders' assets. It's to give a sort of legal scapegoat in case of lawsuits. I think, again, I might be overstating the case, But I think that's what's happening. And so they're, just because a corporation is a legal personhood, I think the reasons for that are very different than chimpanzees being legal persons. Shelley, go ahead. Oh yeah, Shelley, this is great. Shelley's background is business and business ethics. So
Yeah, so this is my area. So a corporation as a legal entity, I think you're spot on. It's to protect the rights of shareholders to not lose more than they invested, which is how the corporation became a legal entity. But there is thought about the non-corporate entity that goes beyond just protecting shareholder value, that is the partnership entity, or even the sole proprietor entity, which is separate and distinct from the owner of that sole proprietorship, as a legal entity that can still conduct business, engage in contracts, take on debts in the name of that non-incorporated legal entity as well. And there is less disconnect between the legal entity of an unincorporated business and the legal entity of the individual, but there's still some degree of distance between the two. And I think, but to try, and I've been struggling as this discussion goes on to try to make the analogy of a business entity to an animal. And it seems hard to me just because we're still defining that business entity by the humans who own it. So I don't know, I'm kind of racking my brains around how that works.
well, you said something really interesting, Shelley, and I wonder if you can direct me, but it sounds like you've identified kind of two reasons for corporate personhood. One is a shield, a risk shield, basically. And the other is to establish it as a business agent, right? You said something like capable of making transactions and entering into contracts and things. So maybe I had overstated the argument earlier. I mean, maybe now with that perspective, there's not such a disconnect. The reason for, let's stick with the chimpanzee example, for making a chimpanzee a legal person is both to differentiate product from person, right? That's the shield part, right? It's no longer, the chimpanzee is not just an object in a zoological park, and it's not just a research subject in a lab. That's the product end, but it's a person, so there's that. But then it also sets it up as having agency, capable of entering into, I don't know what, social contracts, maybe, like having some sort of, and to Nikki's point, maybe that builds the two-way responsibility relationship, right? That we are therefore accountable to.
I like the term agency, because essentially that is, if I remove the corporation and all its legal things and talk just about a partnership as an entity, yes, we attribute agency to that partnership to act on behalf of the partnership and not necessarily on behalf of the humans who own it. So in the same sense, somebody owns the chimpanzee in our traditional sense, so we're giving agency to that chimpanzee separate from the owner of the chimpanzee. So that, I think, is a very good analogy.
I just saw Jason says he's having problems with mic and video, but you probably saw in the chat, Jason had said he wanted to answer the question, why discuss rights? And I think this is, his comment here is relevant, that the reason why we discuss rights from his perspective is that it informs laws, which inform actions, which inform behavior. And to go big picture, as I am wont sometimes, that's a problem for ethics, right? That philosophical ethics has focused on argument. Like, here's an argument why non-human animals matter morally or whatever. But we ethicists, philosophers, have failed in large part, I think, to change behavior. It's sort of a notorious problem in philosophical ethics. And actually, it's a shift. It's part of the reason for a shift a couple of decades ago, or the buildup of moral psychology, with which Florian is intimately familiar. The idea that psychologists are focused on human behavior, and if informed by values, that can be a really powerful gap filler for philosophical analysis. You know, if you think X is the right thing to do and you've rationalized that, you have good arguments for it, how then do you get people to actually perform X, right, in any meaningful way? And so Jason's suggestion is that's why we discuss rights, because the legal is so intimately tied to policy, and policy then incentivizes behavior. And that makes sense to me. I wanted to ask you, one of the things that caught my eye about oh, Florian, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, that made me think about the difference between trying to integrate now. The idea of personhood seems to be a higher level, meaning it is not through somebody else that a thing, an animal, a lake, whatever it is, gets hurt, but it gets hurt directly by assigning it the status of personhood. So I'm wondering whether it would be worthwhile for a while to think about where the edge cases of human personhood are. That is, at what point do we no longer attribute somebody to be a person, somebody to have sort of this innate standalone rights for one? With that, I'm still trying to situate, because to me the idea of giving personhood to these things, or things again that we traditionally don't consider persons, we are elevating them. And I think we're taking them out from our own whim, because we are saying they have a natural right to exist. And this goes also back to the view of indigenous cultures, that the land has a right by itself, by its mere existence, to not be exploited, to not be changed in substantial ways without some form of compact or contract with it. So maybe, I don't know whether that might be something that would interest me, at least. So
I think that's a really interesting suggestion. Can anybody think of limit cases of human personhood? Let's restrict it to a legal sense for right now.
Mhm. I mean, definitely children, right? I mean, at what point are they, do they have that like agency? I mean, I know we have like legal definitions for it, but like it is clearly like argued in the courts and argued like in households and schools and, school boards all around.
So in that sense, Nikki, it's not, so I've got, as many of you know, I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old at home, and my little tiny humans are persons, right? It's hard to think of them as not persons, but I don't afford them the opportunity to make their own decisions in the way that I would all of you, because of their developmental stage, which is closely related to their age. Yeah. So they're persons, but not legal persons in that sense. Joy, yeah, please.
Another place where I think of like legal personhood being kind of given up is especially when like disease progresses and people aren't able to necessarily communicate, or also in cases where the disease may not progress, but it's such a severe disease where their communication is so far outside of the norm that they kind of aren't able to, utilize the agency that they once had.
Joy, that's a tremendous bucket of worms there, right? Because it's partly about communication. It's partly about how we view normal and non-normal agency. It's partly about the extent to which we know. One of these examples that comes to mind is neurological locked-in syndrome. It took a long time before we were able to find strategies with which to communicate with individuals who were locked in, previously having taken them as psychologically dead, right? Only biologically alive. And there were some really interesting and horrible medical errors made there. Yeah, that's a really interesting. Steve, go ahead.
I think there's maybe some distinctions to make between personhood versus, say, adulthood, or personhood derived because an entity is able to communicate or express itself, versus personhood, as Dr. Jensch said, just because the entity exists. So to your point about your children, they are certainly persons, though you don't permit them to make certain decisions for themselves specifically because they're adults. In one context, or they're not adults. In one context, that says maybe they have fewer rights. Are they less of a person? No, they have fewer rights. In another context, they actually have more rights in the sense that you have a socially regarded duty to provide and protect them more so than you have to try to look out for me, for example, because they don't have enough agency. So the inability to protect oneself is not a characteristic that prevents you from being regarded as a person. And to your point about locked-in syndrome, you know, the inability of an entity to take care of itself or to communicate is not why they lose their personhood, right? Someone who is locked in, someone who's comatose still has rights. That's the fundamental reason, or one of the fundamental reasons, I think, why we wrestle with euthanasia. You know, at what point can we, and there's other reasons obviously, but at what point can you take a life? Is it a mercy kill? Is someone alive or not alive? We wrestle with those issues. When does someone become alive? But to your question about limiting cases, when someone dies, I think they lose personhood. They don't lose the entitlement to respect. So one of the reasons, I mean, I don't remember what you call this, but we kind of have an innate sense of disgust or recoil away from, say, mistreating the dead. You know, you don't go, a person is dead, but you wouldn't deface their grave or, you know, mistreat their corpse. There's something hallowed about an individual and even what remains of them after they die, even though they're no longer alive. So are they no longer a person? I think somewhere in there entangled, or somewhere in there, there are things that we need to disentangle, and it's an issue of rights and entitlement. And does that extend from vulnerabilities? Like, is someone a person, they have rights because we don't want harm to come to them? I don't think that's it, because I can harm a mountain, right? But that doesn't mean the mountain is a person. So it's not about vulnerabilities. It's something about perceived sacrosanctness of an entity, maybe because it's alive or was alive. And we have to maybe think about living and its connection to consciousness. But even that's not very helpful, right? There's different levels of consciousness. So I enjoy this struggle, but I don't have the answer. But I think we have to distinguish adulthood from personhood and some other things that might be kind of captured within there.
I agree that a lot of things are entangled, and it's so interesting to hear you talk that through, Steve, because I think what's happening is we're lumping back together the two things that are so hard to disentangle: the legal personhood from the moral personhood. So indigenous communities, and even like Aldo Leopold in the American Midwest, thought that mountains had some sort of personhood, right? The idea that they're yeah, there's a lot in there. Yeah, Florian, go ahead. Sorry. I feel like
I was going to comment on that and actually ask the question: does a mountain not have this implicit right to not be harmed, to not be changed, to not be taken out of whatever happens, quote, to it naturally, however way one conceptualizes those natural things occur, whether by some higher being or through any other process. Because we could extend this even to pieces of art. Let's say, does a piece of art have a right to an existence, even when there's nobody there anymore who owns it, or who cares for it, or who was involved in when it was created? And one could, I think, make the argument that it has a right to its existence, and it should only be changed with a compelling reason. Now, where then and how that negotiation takes place is open to debates for society. But this beginning state of, well, if it doesn't have right or personhood, then we can do whatever we want with it, I think it is problematic.
Yeah, Florian, that reminds me of one of my favorite thought experiments. And I think, Nikki, at least you've probably heard this one before, but This came from Peter Carruthers, animal ethicist in the mid-90s, wrote this book, The Animals Issue, and he developed this thought experiment about Astrid the astronaut. So, and yeah, Steve, you've heard this too, but it gets, I think it gets at Florian's point about the sort of rights of objects. So, yeah, so Carruthers sets up this thought experiment. There's this person, Astrid, and she's an astronaut. She's going away from Earth. She's never going to see anybody again. And she knows she's going to get bored. So she brings with her the cardboard cutout of a cat and 3 darts. And she does get bored on this trip, never seeing anybody else again. And she throws the darts at the cardboard cutout. Does she do anything wrong? And it gets at our students' instincts, moral instincts. And students will say inevitably, no, of course not. Like, she's relieving boredom and there's nobody else around. Like, it's not as though anybody cares about the art such that it is. So she's doing nothing wrong because cardboard doesn't have any rights. You could replace cardboard with the Mona Lisa. But when you, in that thought experiment, shift it and replace the cardboard cutout of a cat with a cat, all of a sudden students' instincts get riled up, right? So there's some sort of moral instinct there that says there's something different between a piece of art, an inanimate object, and a cat. And what is that? And this goes back to Sterling's comment in the chat, like there's a litany of capacities that we could have talked through that a thing might have such that it would have moral personhood or moral standing. But again, what we're doing there is reverting back to the old discussion about like the capacities of a thing such that it has moral standing, which is, just to point out, not the conversation that Anderson and Pina Guzman are having, right? They're saying, forget all that because it's too complicated. You know, is it agency or rationality or language or like whatever? Instead, they're saying, no, all we have to do is convince a court that a thing has legal standing and we've solved the problem, right? That's the problem. What they're doing is skirting the underlying moral issue, the ethical issue. Now, it's really dissatisfying to me as a philosopher, but practically speaking, it has huge impact. So, Stephen, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems really odd to me that we're talking about personhood in such binary terms, either, personhood or non-personhood. For example, in affirmative rights, certain groups of people have perhaps the right to apply and maybe go to a certain institution. But even when you consider like fish, let's have a big fishing trawler off the coast of Alaska. There's a certain place and time when those fish can be fished out of the ocean, but only during those certain place and time. So do those fish have rights? Well, they do. They have legal rights. The group of them, the space and time makes a big difference. Humans too. I mean, there was a time, of course, when women could not vote. Now they have rights. It's hard to talk about it in such binary, personhood versus non-personhood. It seems to me level of rights with time and conditions is something that maybe is more appropriate.
That's super helpful, Stephen, because I think this gets back to Florian's point about the class, the boundary limits of human personhood, right? Because I think that might be true. I was thinking the one class we didn't mention, by the way, all the things we mentioned in answer to Florian are protected classes from institutional review board perspectives. And the one class we haven't mentioned yet is prisoners. But that's very true too, right? They have a restricted sense of personhood, rights in this sense, for a set period of time, depending on what state you live in. And then they get some of those rights back, depending on what state you live in. Florian and then Steve and then Joy. Yep.
Yes. So, sorry to butt in. I just wanted to react because I felt the comment there was relevant. On the fish, though, that Stephen mentioned, this fish wouldn't be who is in court. It's not a lawyer for the fish. It is a lawyer for the government, which as an entity of human beings created some form of law that says, or rule or regulation, that you cannot fish those fish during those days. So again, we are putting there the agency is put on somebody else, not on the fish themselves, but on some caretaker who decided in its magnificence that this is the time when we can fish and this is the time when we cannot fish. I think the novel part here is that the fish themselves have this right, and there is not necessarily a group of people. That's why fish don't necessarily have rights outside of economic exclusion zones. In the open ocean, fish may not have any rights whatsoever. And I think
Well,
personhood would give
people
them
have
that right.
representatives as well, though. As a matter of fact, the individual may not be in court. His attorney may be in court, or the corporation may have an attorney in court. So, I mean, yeah, fish are represented. So are people.
Right, but the point is that what I'm saying is the lawyer is in court not for the fish. The lawyer is in court for the group of humans who decided that the fish could not be fished during that time. If the fish had personhood, then the lawyer would be there on behalf of the fish. But while the fish cannot articulate their idea about whether they want to be fished or not fished, we assume they don't want to be fished. I think that's where the difference is between saying it is an inherent thing versus it is something that is imposed by others upon this. And so you're violating those people's rights, not the actual entity that itself.
Well, it is for sustainability, which is for the fish. So, but yeah, we could go on forever with that argument, I think. So yes.
Let's hear from Joy and we'll circle back around.
Yes, I just wanted to add, when we were on the topic of like loss of human personhood, I just wanted to throw this in to think about. We talk about loss of human personhood a lot, but we don't talk about, because a lot of times that sense of agency and decision making goes somewhere. It doesn't necessarily disappear. Like sometimes it can be passed on to a nearest relative who gets to kind of make those decisions on behalf and stuff like that. So it's when there is nowhere for it to pass, does it really dissipate, or is there someone elsewhere making decisions that are either on behalf or inadvertently affecting that person wherever they are, whatever they're experiencing?
Yeah, Joy, that's well said. I think that ties some things that Stephen and Florian were talking about too. I think one of the things that I think we're seeing is that there are almost as many questions, conceptual questions, philosophical questions around legal personhood as there are around moral personhood, right? It's not the case that it's a clear-cut line that it's always a one-to-one representation, right? That it's not always the case that human beings are always represented as agents. I was thinking here of like class action lawsuits. Here we're thinking about a class of human beings being represented in a legal sense. Human beings also play this role, right? Where stakeholders in a corporation are both individual agents, but they're also resources for the corporation. I mean, I think there's some really interesting philosophy of law questions, and that is not my area, but I think there's some really interesting underlying questions there too. I want to turn our attention to just one moment in the podcast that I thought was really interesting. There was this moment where Anderson was describing being at basically a philosopher's party, but Laurie Gruen's house at a party at Peter Singer's apartment, I guess, so a party for Laurie Gruen. Laurie Gruen and Peter Singer are two big name animal ethicists. And she comes there realizing that she's carrying a leather purse, right? And so there's this moment where she says, oh crap, I'm at this party of animal ethicists and I'm carrying a leather purse. And I can't remember the details exactly, but she like throws it in a broom closet or something and like tries to hide it. And she feels a lot of guilt about this. And so the question maybe that came at that is A, have you ever had experiences like that? And B, what does that tell us about the way that we value, right? Steve,
I guess I have had experience like that. For quite some time, I gathered with a group of Chinese, Taiwanese, and one Indian to study Taoism on the weekend. All of them were vegetarians except for me, but I did not hide the fact. In fact, I defended the fact that yes, I ate a little bit of meat, not a lot, but they still accepted me in spite of the fact that I was a meat eater, but they still pushed me toward vegetarianism, and it has worked to some degree, but I am not fully there yet.
No, that's good, Stephen. Yeah, I think that's what I was after. I mean, what I was thinking about that when I was thinking about that's Ellie's story about the purse was that the values that we think are our own are really probably pretty carefully shaped by our communities. And I think that's really important from the sense of like when we think about how societal ethics change over time, or the way that like when we move from one community to another, or one geographic area to another, one culture to another, our values adapt. Maybe not substantially, right? Stephen, you said you didn't go full vegetarian, but you're thinking about it in a different way now, right? Like we're informed by our communities. I think that's an important point for me. Jason, I saw your question in the chat, and Shelley, you've done a good job here of answering it. So Jason asked, what's agency? And so we've talked now about personhood, and we've kind of backed into the idea that it's kind of related to agency in some sense. Yeah, and I think Shelley's right. Agency is, like most concepts, complicated. Thanks, Nikki, for joining us. Appreciate it. Yeah, from a legal perspective, I think, of course, Shelley would have more experience than I would. That makes total sense. I think from a philosophical perspective, it's the capacity to act. Now, that puts agency on an incredibly wide spectrum, such that single cell organisms are agents. In a way, notably in a way that most, and maybe I'd argue all current computing systems are not agents. Right? A computing system can respond to an input, and maybe a single cell organism can too. So anyway, agency is complicated. And Shelley's right. We could do a whole course on it. And philosophers of mind do this too. Coming full circle. Oh, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, Jonathan, to come full circle and maybe summarize where we got to on rights, because I like the direction also that Dr. Florian and Dr. Jensch was taking us with regard to focus on rights. I'm still not clear what it means to have rights, whether rights are possessed by an entity or whether they're imparted to an entity. Some of the discussion was around whether we as a group give rights, to animals, or whether they inherently have those rights. So the rights question, sure, it can be a legal sense, was a useful one, and I'm not really sure what we concluded.
So I'll let Florian weigh in there too, but I would say here's where I saw us go. I started leading us down the wrong path by thinking about questions of welfare and capacities. And we articulated the sort of rough history of ways in which we tried to build analogies with things that aren't us. And that's been one strategy for giving things moral standing, moral rights. That conversation in the 60s and 70s and 80s between Tom Reagan and Peter Singer, Reagan argued that things had rights in and of themselves. It's not a welfare view. It's not about whether they're experiencing pleasures and pains. It's not utilitarian in Peter Singer's sense. It's deontological. It's a different normative approach. But that's not what this conversation, the podcast, was about. That was about, forget all that business about moral standing. What about legal standing? And that led us down questions of personhood. It led us down questions of agency. It made us ask about limit cases to human beings. We talked about children, adults with various types of diseases. You mentioned, Steve, the dead. I mentioned prisoners. We didn't get around to talking about the unborn, but there's a whole group of classes of human beings which seem to not have legal rights in that full, robust sense. But we had that conversation, but then the thing where maybe where we're ending up, which is I think where we should end up, is that it's not so easy. Because even if you say, cool, the things with legal standing are the things that are going to morally matter, that is placing a policy umbrella over what is fundamentally a moral claim. And so all we're saying is, we convinced a judge that this thing has moral standing, legal personhood. But what we're not doing is answering the more fundamental question, why? Right? It can't be just that a judge agreed or that a lawyer made a compelling argument. I want there to be some sense in which things have intrinsic value. And that's really what this conversation is centered around. There's a sense in which everything has use value, instrumental value. But what philosophers want, what ethicists want, and what I think ethics needs is some story about intrinsic value. What's the class of things that have value in and of themselves? The mountain doesn't matter to me because it's a resource for my consumption, in the sense that we're after a matter of mountain matters in and of itself. And that's an account of intrinsic value. We can put a legal lens on it. We can convince a judge that we ought to give it standing, more legal standing, but that doesn't really answer the moral question. So we kind of come, again, I think, full circle from the moral through the legal back again to the moral, which is frustrating, I know, but I think where ethics is at. Stephen, go ahead.
Well, I think it's very difficult to make these arguments based on the inherent rights of animals. I think a successful legal case can better be made when you tie it back to human conditions, human health. For example, caged animals or animals that are kept together more often pass diseases among themselves. And for that reason, they have to be vaccinated, inoculated, which is bad for human health, as a matter of fact. And that's true even of fish farming. There's a fish cage off the west coast of Florida, as a matter of fact, where fish are kept in a cage, but they actually have to throw medicine in there because those fish are more likely to pass diseases back and forth. And some of the stuff that they throw in there actually goes out into the area beyond the cages as well. I think more and more it's easier to tie those things back to ecology, of which humans are a part, rather than going directly for the inherent rights. So let's see if I can get rid of that. Let me just mention one thing. California voters approved in 2018 by 63 to 37% that requires farms in California to keep egg-laying hens in cage-free housing. It also bans the confinement of breeding pigs in areas with less than 24 square feet of usable floor space. That was done. And all of that really does tie back to human health. I think maybe the people that are making the argument are making it for the inherent rights of those pigs, but it's going to be hard to get it passed without tying it back to what is better for humans.
Yeah, thanks. Ian, go ahead.
I have two related things to bring up on that. And the first is that, if anything, recent events have showed us that laws change. So if something is instrumentally valuable, if an animal, for example, a fish is instrumentally valuable now, in 4 to 8 years, it could be not important to humans for that same reason, and therefore lose the same rights. So I don't know if instrumental value tied to human health or human benefit is necessarily the way to go. But if we assume it is, then my second point is that an ecologist would tell you that every single organism is important for human health, and that if you remove a few of them, okay, fine, but if you remove a certain turning point of no return, there is collapse for ecosystems and collapse for human health. So if you're going to go instrumental, I really feel like it's all or nothing.
Yeah, that makes good sense. You're arguing, Ian, I think, like a public health ethics perspective, where it's the complex interplay of our ecological relationships that upholds health. And as soon as some of those start dropping out, maybe some more readily than others, but you hit that tipping point as you described it. And so, yeah, you have to worry about the entire web of relations. And yeah, so there is a sense in which that's all or nothing. But to Stephen's point, like, yeah, there's that tension between our reasons for value. Part of the reason, and I think that's the legal personhood question too. Part of it is that we want there to be a sense of intrinsic value in the world, and we want to evidence that the best we can. But it's hard not to think about the ways that other things impact us positively or negatively. So everything is in some sense relational. I think a great example of this is several years ago now, the National Institutes of Health banned federally funded research on chimpanzees. And it's been a long process of transferring those chimps from labs to sanctuaries. But I remember Eric Meslin, who's now up in Canada in a research ethics position, he made this really compelling argument that the reason for the ban wasn't necessarily only that chimpanzees had moral or even legal standing. It was that chimpanzees are expensive and they're really a pain in the neck to work with, and they really don't translate, their research really doesn't translate that well to human health. And so there's no point, right? It's like we have better models, and so we don't need to do it anymore. And so his argument was more on the instrumental side than it was on the intrinsic side. But the policy change was driven probably in large part by societal shifts, which were on the moral side. So both of those things, the instrumental and intrinsic, are intimately linked, I think, in all of those decisions. I'm happy to keep going, but I feel like we've spun our wheels around the problem here, which is at least the point of the discussion group here. Stephen, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just make a final argument since you started off talking about trees. You know, the dust storms out west of the 30s were because of failure to realize that crop rotation was necessary. The same is true, I think, of forests. There is an ecological balance, and I think Ian made this point too. It's either all or nothing. The ecological balance is important. So, you know, we are part of that ecology, and preserving the natural balance of things is important to all the animals and the plants, as a matter of fact. And we found out even to the gut bacteria in our own guts, there's an ecology there as well that must be maintained. So, I mean, yeah, it's all or nothing. And once we recognize how closely we are interconnected to this web of existence, the more we can understand the benefits and maybe even the morals, I think, of the other animals that we live with.
I have a comment, Jonathan. I hope this makes sense. I was going down the line of thinking, if there were no sacrifices involved with this question, what would hold us back from extending rights to so many things very easily? You know, the question of, does a mountain have a right? Maybe what holds us back is we know we need to mine mountains, you know, to find copper and beryllium and other things that are important. Okay, well, if somehow we had a source of those minerals such that we didn't need to mine, would we be much more prone to say the mountain has a right? Maybe we wouldn't call it a person, but would we say that there's something about preserving the mountain which you can go and call a right, you know, that might prevent us from harming or defacing the mountain, right? So I was kind of going down that path with my thinking, but then I checked myself and I thought, no, rights are fundamentally about sacrifice, where there's value tension, right? Where we say you don't do this because this entity has certain values and so do you, so your behavior should be one that kind of finds that balance between the two. And maybe in some sense that balance doesn't have to relate directly to personhood or equivalence of the species, that you don't have to necessarily say something has rights because it's a person as I know you to be a person. Maybe we can talk about things having rights even when they're not persons, and we're kind of conflating personhood with rights, and that we need to recognize how it's really about a fundamental value conflict or tension in values. I hope that makes sense, and I don't know, I'd love to see where you take it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And I think, I mean, one of the things to say is that to imagine a world in which everything had rights is to imagine, and I don't, again, to maybe Joy's earlier point, I don't want to over idealize indigenous communities, but the idea that everything is related, that everything is kin, which is a North American indigenous ontological perspective. The idea there isn't that therefore I don't harm anything in the natural world and I basically starve to death. It's that my relationships and my interactions with others come from a place of respect. And so what that would mean, I guess, if you really took that view and you wanted to mine beryllium from a mountain, you wouldn't blow the top of the mountain and take all of the beryllium, you would think, okay, I need beryllium for this technology over here, this device or whatever. And so I need to find a balance between my two competing values, the value of the respect I have for the mountain and the need I have for this device. And maybe in an ideal world, that would lead to fewer devices, right? Mountains with their tops, maybe with a hole in them, there'd be a richer balance. And I think that's the view of personhood, moral personhood. No, I don't, I feel like I'm squishing these two things together again, but yeah, that's the idea of moral personhood, is that it maybe does extend pretty far, right? This is the same argument from animal ethics. Maybe moral considerability extends actually pretty far down the phylogenetic spectrum. The question is not like, if it does, do I never again eat a shrimp? It's that I think about my relationships from a place of respect. And that seems to be very different than I'm going to keep calling it the Enlightenment view, Western Enlightenment view, but the idea that most of the living world is mere resource, that it's there just for my use and for nothing else. And therefore I can use the whole mountain or catch all of the shrimp. To Ian and Stephen's point, like, we know enough about ecology that we can't do that. We know that that leads to ecological breakdown and horrible impacts on human health. But maybe more importantly, on the ethical side, there's a different way of viewing the world that's not a resource view, but a relationship view. And I think this is a trend it's certainly a trend in philosophical ethics, but I think it's a trend in our sort of societal thinking too. And I'm interested to see where that goes. I think more and more young people, and I'll stick myself in that group too, I guess, think along those lines, that the sort of capitalist consumptive model is not the model for the future. And this is like the climate change debate and climate movements, and I mean, it goes on and on, but it, from my perspective, derives from a moral argument. Sterling, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm listening to everything and I'm trying to pull it all in from the mountain point of view, and I think we spoke about this the other day. You know, the mountain might not matter to you, but it may matter to me. And we're talking about, and the quote was, "My world is not made up of matter; it's made up of what matters." But we don't have to go as far as the mountain. If you live near UCF, I don't know if Sanford's the same way, but you know, what's valuable to me, I have my property here, and then, you know, and it's not a matter of resources, it's a matter of county taxation or whatever, making money and just taking everything and developing everything as quickly as possible. So those things matter to me, but apparently the cash value is a lot for the state, for the government, is a lot more important than what matters to me. So
that makes sense. And Florida is a really compelling case. I mean, it's true in Central Florida writ large, but the idea that development has taken precedence over almost anything else is a value decision, right? It's a decision that capital, in that like old Marxist sense, matters most. Matters more than long-term climate issues or human health or economic welfare. The short-term economic gain matters most. And I'm not sure there's a compelling underlying like worldview at work there. I think it's just drive. It's policy and practice and habit and all of those things. But yeah, I'm in the same boat. I mean, I think most of us would say about the places that we live, that we care about them, right? That we care about our property and our trees and our rivers and the things that are proximate to us, and the things that we rely on, and we don't want them to be.
yeah, well, and another point that I don't think we focused on enough, and it goes back to you as a parent of your little ones, and they're moral patients rather than moral agents in that point of view, is our level of responsibility. So we didn't focus enough on what responsibility makes us, the concept of personhood is, I think, a lot depends on the tremendous amount of responsibility. You know, how much does responsibility give an individual's life value? You know, is happiness what gives your life worth, or responsibility? And I think we could really load up on that thought of responsibility. I'll stop
Yes.
there.
That makes sense, Sterling. Yeah, what I hear you describing that sort of traditional tension between the happiness, welfare, utilitarian side and the rights and responsibility deontological side of the normative claim. Like these are two competing approaches to the way that we value and are valued in the world. Yeah, two normative theories.
Yeah, we also didn't get into the AI and the robots that are coming in our future and all of that stuff. So that's a lot more to discuss.
Yeah. Steve mentioned AI and personhood. And I think there is an interesting story to tell there. We've restricted our conversation to natural objects, but I think there's a world of informational objects that is coming, maybe already here, that is going to challenge that conversation of rights and person even more. A good example of that, although it was kind of strange, was the Google employee who lost his job a couple of months ago for claiming that Google's AI was sentient. And so there's a lot to talk about there for sure. Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, friends, thank you. This was a lot of fun. I'm really grateful that you were all here. We've got a schedule coming up. Our next event is on September 27th. We're going to talk there about extraterrestrial environmentalism. Steve and I ran into some colleagues in a coffee shop earlier in the summer who have done a lot of thinking and getting some good funding to think about moon projects and space research. And that got me thinking about rights and responsibilities outside the planet. So we'll be doing that next. There's a podcast associated there, and we'll meet every last Tuesday of every month from 3 to 4:30. And as I said, there may be some special events that we'll schedule in. And so I'll send you all notes about that. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and feel free to reach out to Steve or I if you've got questions about the center or things you want to talk about related to ethics.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated. Good talk.
Thanks, everybody.
That was great. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.